Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Hong. I am the director of the Center for Racial Justice, along with my co-organizer, Becca Covarrubias, Associate Professor of Psychology, and the members of our amazing planning team, Taylor Ainsley, Domingo Canizales, and Chisa Hughes. I am very pleased to welcome you to the culminating event of a three-part series organized by the CRJ. This event centers invisible staff and faculty labor. Both the Institute for Social Transformation and all 5 divisions co-sponsored this important series. It is being recorded and will be available on the CRJ website for any of you who wishes to view it afterwards. The first event in this series featured the heads of the faculty and in some cases faculty and staff community networking groups. And the second featured a research presentation by Becca and Kat Quinteros on the report Calling Out Whiteness, which examines how faculty of color both perceive and have transformed structures of university leadership. Their presentation in our last event was followed by brief overviews of action plans in response to their research findings by each of the divisional deans or their delegates. All of these are archived as Zoom recordings on the CRJ website under events. Today's event centers a discussion of invisible faculty and staff labor. This is, to no small degree, the giant pink elephant in the room. This campus has been majority minority in terms of student composition since the 2008-2009 academic year, but it remains 67% white in terms of faculty demographics, and it remains 70% white in terms of upper management. So this is the kind of situation structural situation that we find ourselves in. We're we're at the same time an HSI, an ANAPISI, but in terms of the meaningful power dynamics on this campus, we are a principally white institution, right? So this corresponds to labor implications for faculty, staff, and students of color and other marginalized demographics on this campus. And I want to say too that personnel, in terms of personnel review processes, what occurs for faculty is very different from what occurs for staff, but we're addressing a common structural problem, and we are having a very critically expansive discussion that doesn't just center faculty invisible labor, but also centers staff invisible labor because it's in the interest of all of us to work together in solidarity. I also want to mention that recently there was an IRAPS report that came out. It's very, very problematic in terms of how it's being framed in a very overly optimistic light. That deserves a separate CRJ discussion. And so please look for that. So in terms of invisible labor, I just want to say that it's the sort of thing that we all see. Many of us experience it. It takes a toll on us physically. I'll bring up my own, cold as an example. Even though it is everywhere, we stop short of coming up with meaningful solutions to address it. So to be able to see something, to recognize it in a way, but then to turn away from it is the classic definition of disavowal. And so this event is called Recognizing Invisible Labor. But really what we want to say is it's not just recognizing, it's doing something about it. We want to do something about it. The status quo is not serving us. It's certainly not serving our students. And so I want to just say something in terms of ground rules. For this particular event, unlike our prior two, we have a more restrictive webinar format. There will be time for Q&A at the end. which Becca and I will co-facilitate. In the meantime, we do ask you, if you have an idea that you'd like to share, a comment that you'd like to share, or even a question, place it in the chat. We aren't able to brainstorm together, certainly not the way that we do in our classrooms, but we invite you to view the Q&A function as a brainstorming tool. Any idea that you input in there, we will take stock of that. So I want to say that we have invited people from both UCLA and Berkeley to speak about how their campuses are beginning to address the issue of invisible labor. We thought that would be very instructive to have comparison. So we're going to proceed in this order. We have this amazing lineup of people. We have Margaret Shih, who is the Associate Vice Chancellor in the UCLA Office of DEI. She is also the Neil Jacoby Chair in Management in the Anderson School. We also have Emily Ozer, who is a professor of community health sciences at UC Berkeley. Following our outside guests will be Becca Covarrubias, who will summarize some of the through lines from the prior two discussions to keep those animated as part of our overall conversation today. Stefano Profumo, who will be joining us shortly, who is the chair of the Committee on Academic Personnel and professor of physics, is also going to speak about what CAP is thinking about and perhaps is willing to undertake in terms of invisible labor. Stefano will be followed by Shauntay Larkins, who occupies a certain position today, but it'll be a different position on Monday. Shauntay is currently the CRES assistant manager and the lead advisor in our department. As of Monday, Shauntay will be stepping into the role of inaugural director of student success in the humanities. We are also really honored to have Dr. Jackie Rabouin, who's a licensed therapist with a PhD in East-West psychology, who is in counseling and psychiatric services, or CAPS, on this campus. So I would like to go ahead and hand things over to Margaret.
Thank you, Dr. Hong. Thank you for inviting us to this important event. And I'm very, very honored to be here today. So I guess I will just tell you a little bit about UCLA in the context that we find ourselves in and the work that we're doing. And I just want to say that it's very much a work in progress at UCLA as well. I am currently the Associate Vice Chancellor in the UCLA Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And just to sort of lay out the context of at UCLA of where it is, UCLA is very motivated to improve our climate at UCLA on campus and to improve inclusiveness and equity. And it's because part of it was because in 2013, the Moreno report was issued. And what the Moreno report did, Judge Moreno, was study the racial climate at UCLA and found inequity and discrimination experiences for our faculty of color. And so UCLA needed to fix that, basically. And so one of the recommendations of this report was to establish our office, the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And this office has basically two departments, I guess, or two parts. The Office of Civil Rights, which does all the investigations into complaints, and then the Office of Research and Bruin Engagement, which is sort of a more forward-looking, proactive part of the office, working to prevent and a lot of what we see in the complaints and promote inclusiveness and equity. So there, we work very closely with other offices on campus to identify issues and try to rectify them. So the UCLA, our first Vice Chancellor of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, Jerry Kong, worked very hard to sort of establish the infrastructure. And one of the things that he promoted was accountability to transparency, and using empirically validated methods to promote inclusiveness and equity. And one of the things that we've found in research is accountability through transparency is one of the more effective ways of trying to promote equity. And so he believes very much in transparency. So for example, people know that they're being sort of watched and everything is public, people will be much more vigilant about making sure things are equitable. So we publish dashboards. If you go to our website, you'll see dashboards where you can look up sort of the demographics of staff or faculty in any unit or institution on our campus. We've also started looking to see benchmarks, right? So how do the faculty diversity compare to on certain measures to the California population, or how do the student demographics compare to the California population or the US population, or the national availability of PhDs across different departments. There's also longitudinal data for separations and hires over the last 10 years. We also publish the Public Accountability Report every year, which sort of talks about how many investigations our office has done, and sort of very broad strokes without violating confidentiality of what types of investigations were done. The Chancellor recently also appointed special advisors. So now there's a special advisor to our Chancellor on Black life, on Native American and Indigenous affairs, on immigration policy. We've also established equity advisors, and these are faculty across all the different units on campus who sort of work and provide leadership on matters of equity, diversity, inclusion within their unit. So we would have an equity advisor for the business school, and there'd be an equity advisor for the law school, and they come together once a month to talk about these issues. Our office is also provides oversight to all of the searches, all of the faculty hiring, ladder faculty hiring and recruiting across campus. And every year there's about 100 FTE that we have to monitor and make sure that the process of hiring and recruitment is done equitably and properly. So the school is also very, very much aware about invisible labor. And again, this is a work in progress. The Academic Personnel Office did a study on invisible labor, and unsurprisingly found that our faculty of color and female faculty have an unfair share burden of labor. And so they've been working together with the Academic Senate on trying to figure out how to rectify this situation and properly compensate. And some of the things that they've done last year together with the Academic Senate, there was an email, campus-wide email that was sent reminding everybody that we need to consider service and what is considered service, and to be vigilant about making sure that service is divided equitably. And they're working on sort of defining, well, what does count as service, and providing guidance to CAP about what to do. And also training faculty on proper guidance. In terms of compensating, that is a little bit more complicated. We've for example, recognized now invisible labor. We've created this is the first year, honorary mentoring society to honor those faculty who do a lot of mentoring, particularly for our underrepresented faculty. And so there's still a lot of work to do, but this is sort of where things are at UCLA. Thank you.
Margaret, thank you so much. It's so good to hear what's happening and to realize that, Santa Cruz is only just starting to embark on some of the initiatives that seem to be so well underway at UCLA. And certainly, although we can look forward to having a Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, this person will not have oversight over the personnel process. So that is already one very critical distinction between what UCLA is doing and what is happening here. The compensation part is also very interesting. I hope that we will return to that in a robust way. And finally, I just would say that I'd really love to hear during the Q&A what categories APO, the Academic Personnel Office, looked for in doing an invisible labor survey. How did they assess this, and how did they extract that information? Thank you so much. I'd like to turn things over to Emily.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be a part of this discussion. And let me see if I'm able to share screen. Okay. Okay, are you seeing that? Yes, no? Yes, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to tell a little bit about what's happening at Berkeley, also very much a work in progress, and look forward to hearing how it might relate to what you're doing at Santa Cruz. I've already started down this journey a little bit. I see my colleague Gina Langhout is in the house as a part of this conversation, and we have a paper that we wrote with our colleague Rona Weinstein at Berkeley that I will provide a link to a blog post about our story related to the work we're doing about institutional change to reward community engaged scholarship, and that links to the paper that Gina co-authored as well. So I want to just briefly introduce our institutional work. Some of this has been written up, invite connections, and just to say that this focus with the time I have today is really focusing on the faculty evaluation side of things. So this is our steering committee for the W2 grant, Institutional Challenge Grant, which has really given us the space and a little bit of funding to really think institutionally about our challenges related to community engaged scholarship. And I'm happy that Santa Cruz also was recently awarded this grant, and I know has been doing a lot of important work with starting I think it's the C+C, if that's the name of it, that center on campus. But importantly, this is work that cuts across different units and also in partnership with our community partners. So these are the slides, some of the slides that I've shared with our provost and with other leaders on campus. So this is how we're framing the work at Berkeley. We know that public purpose is core to our mission and to the UC mission. And yet we really lack the institutional supports. There are many disincentives, both in the faculty evaluation side and also in the research administration, IRB, funding sides to do this work. And so that's what we're trying to do at Berkeley. This is sort of, we really are focusing on research with, so on the right side of this frame, but realizing there's important, healthy debates about the Venn diagram of what does partnered scholarship look like? Does it apply to industry partnerships? Does it apply across campus? So I won't go into that, but happy to raise that in Q&A. As we've framed it, that there are very special pain points for doing research with. It doesn't fit the grooves of how our systems are set up on campus and how our faculty evaluation system works and what's credited primarily. And as already noted by my UCLA colleague, these are also equity issues. These are DEIBJ issues in terms of often who's doing that invisible work. Unlike what you are starting to develop at Santa Cruz, we actually do not have a community engagement hub beyond our units. We have a longstanding public service and we have awards for research in the public interest, but there's no centralized. So as we do this work and as we frame it for campus leaders and for our colleagues across campus, we're really trying to do work that lifts all boats and acknowledge that there are many different forms of partnered research, and not just in the social sciences, but there are many ways in which colleagues if we think about the last couple of years, the way that virologists and epidemiologists and so many people who work on racial justice across campus, there's so many ways that folks are focused on the public interest and public impact. So this is not just one part of campus. And this is the slide we worked on a lot to try to communicate that. We're looking like we're not all in the same boat, but we're trying to do work that lifts all boats. This is the aim. These are the aims of our initiative. And we're really thinking about institutional changes, because those of us on the call who do partnered scholarship know about those pain points, how hard it is to pay community partners, if they're young people, to get money in and out of our systems. I don't know how bad it is at Santa Cruz, but it's challenging at Berkeley. But we want to think beyond workarounds to institutional changes. So I want to cut to where we've had momentum, where we've had some wins so far. So one of the main places we have had, I'm going to actually cut to the, I don't know to the extent you can read this, but in January 2021, we had some new guidelines that were established for assessing community engaged research in our merit and promotion cases. These are guidelines. These are at the level of the vice provost for the faculty. This is the website. And this is, so this was an important win to our knowledge. I don't think there are guidelines at other campuses, other UC campuses related to this. I know our folks at UCLA and others are interested in adopting some of these guidelines. But what this essentially does is it says, much of what we is often considered to be service because it is outside the traditional peer-reviewed categories of scholarship, be those articles or books, are scholarship. And this lays out what counts as scholarship. So for example, folks who work on white papers or briefs that are very focused on policy or practice changes, that is scholarship. And if it's recorded, if it's disseminated, that counts as scholarship. And as we know, it's extremely important what's in the scholarship category. And so we have these guidelines, but as we know, and I will say these guidelines were written by our budget committee, which is our CAP committee. This was written by the chair of our CAP committee and then approved by our vice provost for the faculty. It's now going to be integrated into training for deans and chairs. So we have these guidelines. They are not sufficiently disseminated. And it's a win, but it doesn't get to departmental culture or departmental discussions. We can have these guidelines at the campus level, but if the cases that come up are only focused on impact factor in journals, but don't also talk about public impact, that's doesn't go far enough. So these are linked in the document that I mentioned. They're linked in the blog post. And they're linked in the article with Gina in the American Psychologist that recently came out. So we have many challenges and next steps I'd love to talk about with you all. And we now have a UC-wide steering committee considering some of these issues. But how do we really measure this? How will we know if we're making a difference? And then how do we sustain this on campus in a more institutionalized way? What the commons will look like? Here's a site, UC Davis, as many of you might know, has a Michael Rios is the vice provost for public scholarship and engagement. Tessa Hill from the earth sciences. So again, this is something that cuts across STEM and non-STEM fields at Davis. Stanford has huge donor funds to try to support this work. And as UCLA, here's from your strategic plan. I know you're very much focused on engagement at UCLA. So we've been working on trying to figure out what we envision for Berkeley. We know our cultures have similarities and differences. And with that, looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Wow, Emily, that's so great. And just again, these resources will be available through links on the CRJ website. And thank you so much for offering us so much food for thought in that. I wanted to pass things over to Becca.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to share space with you today, and I appreciate what's been shared so far, because it overlaps actually really nicely with some of the through lines of the prior conversations that we've had as part of this series. I just want to put a note to say that there's so much rich information that happened in those exchanges in the conversation. So I'm just going to distill a couple of the points, but I do encourage folks to revisit the recordings, because there's a lot of expertise, a lot of wisdom, a lot of experience, and a lot of shared ideas around how to do this work collectively and in coalition. But I do want to share the broader, I think, themes that I think are through line across the three conversations. So the one place that I'll start that I thought was pretty stark was that people just want to be seen and heard. And that means a host of things, but really it's the recognition of the deep dedication and expertise that folks are bringing to what they're calling labor of love that came up in the research studies, but also came up in the conversations. It's the recognition of expertise of minoritized folks for many years having to navigate spaces that are not designed for them, and how we leverage that to then create what folks are calling equitable spaces now in our roles as faculty or staff for folks that come behind us in that pathway. It's also expertise in creating communities of care where people, also feel very cared for and seen and validated and affirmed as they are. And so I think the other part of the recognition process is knowing that that's a lot of emotional work that can't be quantified and sometimes can't be measured, but that some recognition of that and how that emotional work is essential for the mission of servingness that the institution and many like it are promoting and claiming and aspiring to be. And some of that is really, I think, central to what servingness means. Another piece that I think came up in the conversation was that part of that recognition is also understanding all of the past harm that has been done, that people come in ready for transformational change, ready to give their gifts, ready to be part of a greater mission, and that over time folks feel burnt out by either bureaucratic kinds of interactions, transactional interactions, lack of resources, this topic of invisible labor. And so part of the recognition work, I think, is needing to include maybe some restorative justice processes, depending on the context and the partners involved, so that we can heal from some of that harm, so that the relationships that have lost some of the important trust, some of that openness that I think a lot of us sort of come with in the institution to begin with. So a lot of that can be repaired so that we can then re-engage into wanting to collaborate and cooperate and to envision, I think, a space that we originally came with. So I heard that in the conversation as well. So I wanted to start there because I thought that that was really related to the idea of just seeing people as people and for their strengths and talents and all the beautiful things and contributions that they bring. That said, I think people beyond just an informal recognition and some of that restorative work, folks also talked about structural recognition and the need for structure. And that's really where our conversation is centered today. I'm just going to point 5 things out that came up in those conversations that, again, relate to what we're talking about. So one structural point, and Christine, you mentioned some of the structural diversity issues that we encounter on our campus and like many others like it. That we need to appoint leaders who are committed to DEI work. And that either means having past experience doing DEI work, leadership training in that area. What I heard in some of the past recordings was that, minoritized folks want to be at the table, but we don't want to be tokenized in that process. And if we're being asked to be at that table, having sufficient resources to do the work. So I think part of the burnout that I heard was that, and of experience, is that people are asked to do these sort of leadership roles without proper resources, infrastructure, support to do them, and then the issue of recognition on top of that. So we have to think strategically about what it means to, appoint leaders, but in ways supporting them holistically in that work so that those efforts don't fail. Or that folks aren't burnt out by that process. The second thing that I heard was the use of data. So whether that's surveys that the networking groups have conducted or departments conduct, or our research findings that we shared, also the use of institutional research data to understand patterns. But the goal is to continue to study this, but have a meaningful intention on how we use that data so that we're not just creating reports. One thing that was really clear from our research findings that people were asked to do these climate surveys, but it almost seemed like it was to appease the goal of DEI. So then I think one participant called it where reports go to die. So they do the report and nothing sort of comes from that work. Or the other issue I think I heard too was the idea of misusing data, actually. And this is sort of grounded in the scholarship of critical race quantitative intersectionality, where if we're going to use institutional data and do analysis on particularly inequities between different groups, that we have a responsibility to disaggregate data along important social positions and identities. Also a responsibility to not see numbers as static or as neutral, that the numbers don't speak for themselves. In fact, that we need to understand the context behind the numbers to really understand the social justice issues at play. And that when we go into those kinds of data gathering and data analysis approaches, that we conduct a work in a way that's committed to social justice and transformation, so that we do a really thoughtful job in how we use data and surveys on our campus. The third thing that I heard was just a complete rethinking of the personnel review process. And I'm going to just provide a quote from Associate Dean and Professor Rovello, who said, the UCSC mission is multifaceted, and we need a model that reflects that. Broaden our definition of research and reward those with outstanding contributions in service and teaching, including those contributions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Where we left off in our last conversation, where we can begin today, is what that rethinking looks like. And I know there now is movement toward this, but it'd be really great to think that collectively. But related to my other point is that there needs to be institutional resources for really reimagining what this looks like, so that it's not sort of these one-off conversations. I think fourth is that we need to rethink structures, again, that lead to burnout and attrition. Folks talked about being very tired. I talked about the emotional sort of labor involved. One idea was that, part of our personnel review process was that it rewards people to be excellent at all three things. And that is a recipe for burnout, as Professor Ravello said, in the sense that just to get a small increase in our pay, we need to be excellent at everything that we're doing. And it's so hard to do that and very emotionally exhausting. And I can just say personally, after 7 years of being here, I think I've experienced that idea of burnout. And, and it comes at a cost to the ways that we connect with our students, with ways that we connect with each other. And I want to be here for long term, and I want to be happy doing this work. So I think the bigger ask is to think about what structures are leading to that sort of burnout and attrition that are making folks leave the profession as a result. And then the fifth thing that I'll just say is that what I heard is that the culture change work cannot be shallow, that people don't want these sort of like small attempts at diversity, but really the structural meaningful changes. And I'll connect this a little bit to, students can feel this as well. I know we haven't talked about students in the most direct way, but it's all related to that. I mean, when I think about servingness, when we talk about invisible labor, all of the work that we're talking about is in service to the students that are on our campus in a really real, loving and caring way. And so I'll just put a plug in that for our students, I had a group of, these were students who identified as low income first generation students of color. And they talked about, they ran focus groups with, close to 50 students on our campus who had the same similar shared identities. And they talked about how they came to UC Santa Cruz because of the social justice mission, because of the different culture. And yet when they came here, they encountered all these sort of structural barriers related to servingness, not being able to access critical resources on campus like CAPS or the ethnic resource centers, recognizing that they were understaffed, recognizing that research opportunities are limited because faculty are pulled in many different ways. And so their project really centered on the notion of performative activism, that what happens when an institution commits publicly to a mission of servingness and talks about the plethora of resources involved, but the reality is that students navigate quite a bit of bureaucratic, I think, barriers when trying to access those resources. So again, the bigger part here is that culture change matters because the everyday members can feel it. And that includes us in this conversation, but most importantly includes the students that we serve here. And so I'll leave it there because I know that we'll transition into some of the experiences of staff who are at the front lines of also surveying our students and how those resources are also impacting and contributing to the invisible labor of our staff, importantly.
Becca, thank you so much. I wanted to say just very briefly that, what you're saying about students is so true, that like students have had to undertake agitation on this campus in order to catalyze change. CRES is now, we're in our first year as a department, and we're going to have a celebration. And we hope that students who fought for CRES back in the day will join us. But many of those students that fought for CRES took a far longer time to degree, including up to 1 to 2 more years. And so it shouldn't be that I was thinking about this at the campus with its sort of white leadership structure is like Horton Hears a Who, and here we are, the Who's, down at the bottom trying to shout, and it takes so much to get that message across. And it just feels that structure makes it with no sort of easy access to the central administration, makes it extraordinarily difficult to address some of these issues that impact us all in such major ways. So I wanted to turn things over to Stefano Profumo, who will speak from a CAP perspective and also mention that CRES has already been in conversation with Stefano about some of these issues. And, one of the, among other things that we suggested were, what about the possibility of there being not, because the structure as it exists hasn't worked for us, and it shouldn't be up to the sort of fickleness of committee composition to determine whether or not there will be just outcomes. And so, but let me turn things over to Stefano and just say that one thing that we had suggested was that there be a cluster or a team of people who had DEI oversight on CAP, committee of 13, have at least 3 people whose job it is to undertake that. And then also to take up Professor Ravello's suggestion, how do we think beyond the 3 bucket models? Let's not be hamstrung by this. Stefano, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine, for having me today. So just very briefly, I'm a professor of physics, and I've been serving on CAP as a member for 2 years. I'm chair for this year, and I will be chair next year. It's been a pretty interesting experience. So let me first say that I wish I had 13 members in CAP. There's only 11, but I certainly concur with with the need to make sure that through CAP's membership, the emphasis that, Christine, there is on recognizing DEI on this particular CAP is maintained. And so let me just preface a couple of things there. One is that the 3 buckets are actually not up to us. They are system-wide mandates on what the mission of a faculty member in the University of California system is. And that mission includes the 3 buckets: research, teaching, and service. So, when we inquire about DEI being built in as a standalone category in the evaluation of personnel's performance, that turned out not to be possible because of system-wide policy. On the other hand, the way in which DEI has worked, recognition of DEI work as operationally worked on this CAP, and in my experience in previous CAPs, has been to recognize DEI work within categories. Now, our friends from other UC campuses are not necessarily aware of the existence of a UCSC specific special salary practice, which used to be known as the Merit Boost program, where essentially the idea was to try to bridge the salary gap between UCSC, which systematically the lowest paying or one of the two lowest paying UC campuses, up to maybe not where Berkeley is, maybe not where UCLA is, but at least the other 7. And so that's when the special study practice came about. And as part of that, the way it works is you get a boost if your performance exceeds expectation in any one of the 3 categories. And so, I've had many conversations with Christina. That is a great recipe for burnout, especially in a context which is one where the cost of living here in Santa Cruz is actually the highest for all locations, including Berkeley this time, of UC campuses. And so, when I was chair of CFW a few years back, I started the first analysis of salaries taking into account cost of living. And I don't know why, but the administration didn't like that study. But the bottom line is that the special study practice is not enough. It's not working because of the issues that you've pointed out of burnout, because we've got assistant professors that to get that extra $1,500, do whatever they can. They overburden themselves in the category of service. They overburden themselves, especially in the category of service, trying to get to that beyond expectation. And so there, the way I see this is, on the one hand, we have to look long and hard at the special study structure, special study practice structure. And I can promise you that we will do that this summer. Every time I see our EVC, I tell her we will do these over the summer. And I really hope that this is conducive not only to a better form of the special study practice, but hopefully to a better structure of the special study practice. And so that's one direction. When it comes, again, to recognition of DEI in the evaluation of personnel files, again, by UC Monday, we have to look at where DEI work fits in the 3 famous buckets, unfortunately, even though, of course, especially during the pandemic, we have made extensive use of the notion of fungibility on the one hand, and a holistic view of the 3 buckets as much as possible, and met with strong resistance from the administration, who tends to reply, well, but that is not service, but teaching by itself, blah, blah, blah. So lots of resistance, but I view as the path forward, acknowledging DEI at the personnel review level as it relates to teaching, service, and in some circumstances, not in my discipline, but in other disciplines within research as well. So how to do that? What are the best practices? Well, and this sort of relates to the theme of invisible labor and how to make it visible. Luckily, the UC system has a fairly transparent personnel review process where candidates have the opportunity to look step by step at what's going on with their files. And in practice, what that means is that we have the ability to respond to the departmental letter, number 1, to the dean's letter, number 2, and then, of course, we have the ability to appeal the final authority and their decision. So, while the obvious place to make invisible labor visible is one's personal statement, we've got these additional layers. And at each one of these steps, and I know it's a burden, but it is an important exercise to do for us all. We have to see whether our department acknowledges what we've been doing, whether our division acknowledges it, and finally, whether the final deciding authority, be it the Chancellor, the EVC, acknowledges it suitably, and of course CAP as well, but we don't make decisions. So it is laborious. It is another step, but that's what needs to be done to get this through, or at least these are my 2 cents. Christine, you also mentioned having a sort of a DI task force within CAP, and I brought this, as I mentioned to you, to the committee, which met this suggestion sort of with, in some sense, surprise because of how much DI gets discussed in this CAP. And so, the feeling was we are doing that and taking it very, very seriously. So, there's no point in having an additional task force within CAP to do that, to do something that we are already sort of doing. But I remain, as you know, very open to suggestions. We can always do things better. We can always do things in a more equitable manner. And I'm here to listen.
Yes, thank you, Stefano, for coming here and for engaging in conversation with us. That one of the arguments that was made against the formation of critical race and ethnic studies, even though students were agitating for it, was that everyone does race. So, why do we need an ethnic studies program? And I also want us to think about the argument that, okay, CAP's doing a great job with regard to DEI, but that message is not lived or experienced by the people who are impacted the most. And, I'm worried about, even if there is a transparency of review process, it places an enormous burden on already burnt out minoritized faculty to have to take extreme proactive measures against voices of authority in the personnel process in order to manifest the invisible work that they're doing. So it takes more work to make that visible. So that's just my concern about that. I would like to turn things over to Shauntay Larkins, with whom I have had the privilege and honor of working very closely the past few years. Shauntay, take it away.
Thank you, Christine. I'm just going to share my screen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Christine, for having me, and thank you, everyone, for joining. As Christine mentioned, I recently accepted a new position as the Director of Student Achievement for the Humanities Division, and I'm still currently very much Assistant Manager of CRES. So I just want to jump right into my slides and really share kind of what I've been doing since rejoining campus in 2014 when I returned to UC Santa Cruz in admissions. And so I am currently, one of my positions right now, one of the official positions that I hold on campus is Vice Chair of the Onyx Black Faculty and Staff Association. This is actually UCSC's first official Ethnic Affinity Association. We were officially formed on March 22nd of this year. And it initially served as like a loose congregation of ABC identified faculty and staff, just to get together for social reasons, to build community and commiserate and feel connected. And we have since, again, become an official group. There were 3 official positions created. So there's chair, I'm the vice chair, and we are still currently looking for a historian or secretary. And the chair, in addition to creating events on our campus for retention purposes, also meets with the system-wide Black at UC to discuss issues of concern across all of the campuses related to ABC faculty staff retention. One of the things that I think is actually an improvement is that our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, wanted to formally recognize this work. And so they actually created some small stipends for the leadership, so the chair and the vice chair, as well as a programming budget. So no longer do we have to necessarily spend out of pocket to create these opportunities to build community, which I actually thought was a step in the right direction. I'm also a member of the Campus Inclusive Climate Council, also known as KIC. And this is a group, and Christine is also on this committee as well. This is made up of faculty, administrators, staff, undergraduate and graduate students, as well as community members and alumni, and was set up to work with our Chief Diversity Officer to advise the Chancellor on matters that will help build our diversity and improve equitable practices and identify strategies for inclusivity on our campus. The other official committee that I'm a part of is the Black Experience Team, or BET. And I joined the committee June of 2014, shortly after arriving on campus. And then I served as co-chair of the committee from 2017 to 2019. This team originally emerged in 2014. Based on the results of a campus climate survey and reported incidents of hate and bias. And the results of these surveys and hate bias reports were so dismal in terms of how the Black students were feeling on campus. And so the previous Chancellor Blumenthal, created this committee. And we basically served to advise the Chancellor and EVC on ongoing recruitment, retention, and campus climate strategies surrounding African, Black, and Caribbean students on campus. If you're interested in the results of these surveys, there's the official BET report that identified some of the key demands of Black students and needs on this campus. You can go to the Office of DEI website and go to committees and go to BET, and there's links to those reports there. So you can actually read some of the feedback from students and see what the findings were and what some of the top recommendations were. Some of those top recommendations included an ABC recruiter in the Office of Admissions, as well as an EBC retention specialist, and then also an ABC specialized licensed psychotherapist or counselor. And you'll hear from my colleague Jackie a little bit afterwards to fill those positions. So those were the key positions that were identified by ABC students on this campus, along with some other things. But you understand that we're talking about students were looking for a mechanism to recreate the Black student community on campus, as well as someone who was going to look after making sure that they were retained and could actually make it to graduation. And then someone who could provide mental health care for them, who was knowledgeable of the types of issues that students were going to encounter, whether it be in their home life, their community, or navigating hostile spaces here on campus. So those are my three official positions, in addition to the ongoing work of advising students for CRESS. Some of the other hats that I've worn and continue to wear on campus. I'm part of the Black Academy planning team. Black Academy is a program that was designed to support and guide students in their transition to the university, as well as provide a general introduction to the people and resources that will help new students, thrive and navigate the university. The first Black Academy kicked off in 2016 when my colleague, Erin Jones, now the director of EOP, was initially hired in as the ABC retention specialist. And so that continues to be a mainstay and is housed in the African American Resource and Cultural Center, one of our ethnic resource centers here on campus. So I assist in a variety of different ways. Just with this planning team, I sit on a number of committees within the planning team. I help plan the logistics and food. I help identify speakers. So when our students are admitted, our ABC students are admitted to campus and they apply to the Black Academy, you know, who's going to be talking to them about how to navigate a PWI or public white institution, what is some of the hidden curriculum that they're going to encounter, how to utilize the resources at a Research One institution. And then I also do Black Academy mentor hiring. So who are the student representatives that are going to be leading the different workshops and welcoming Black students to campus. Excuse me. During the pandemic, I hosted Zoom rooms and was also a speaker myself on many of these different panels. Since I arrived on campus, I've also worked directly with all of our ethnic resource centers, so not just the African American and Resource Cultural Center, but also the other four, the American Indian, the Latinx Student Center, El Centro, as well as our Asian American Pacific Islander Resource Center. And what I've done with those students is work with them as a mentor and advisor, speaking at brown bag lunches and other professional events for the undergrads. I also have worked with some of the student initiated outreach groups on campus who would bring students, prospective students to campus, and speaking to them as well about how to navigate the university. And then last but not least, you can see from the pictures, Black Grad. It's a big event here on campus, and I also volunteer at that event as well. So the second slide is really just an illustration of the breakdown that Christine mentioned when we opened today. And you can see, I think it's actually very self-explanatory, but you can see from the breakdown, hopefully by the color coding, how the management, the senior management group is predominantly white. And this is a problem because that's where the policies get made. That's where the policies get made that impact how faculty and staff move on this campus and how students experience this campus. And it's all related. It also means that staff of color who are concentrated in the PSS band are left to support marginalized students on a majority minority campus. So you can see how we can very quickly get burned out when we're wearing so many different hats. And I think it's not a coincidence that when I turn up to participate in some of these events like Black Academy Planning and Black Grad, that it's the same faces, right? It's the same faculty. The ABC admitted student events that we have now to welcome Black students who've been admitted to the campus and to try and, you know, recruit them to come here and see what UCSC has to offer, which is a lot, but it's not enough. And then my last slide, I just really wanted to talk about the way forward. And I've had this discussion with Christine and my supervisor, Taylor. I've also had this conversation with other colleagues here on campus. And I wanted to start by saying you can't talk seriously about student success, which is the other hat I'm starting to wear, without committing the proper resources, which includes staff. Faculty is important, but staff are the ones that are actually dealing with students and kind of their day-to-day encounters with this university. In my advising, I'm not only working with students who are pursuing CRES or the Black Studies minor, but I'm also working with students in other departments because they're feeling alienated because of the experiences that they've had either in the classroom or with another staff person. I'm also getting students who can't get in to see Dr. Jackie in a timely fashion. So I'm triaging issues for students because there's such a lack of staff resources here on this campus. So yes, hiring more staff and faculty of color with a particular attention to the MSP band also means compensating us to come to this campus. this area is very expensive, and students aren't the only ones dealing with micro and macroaggressions when they come to this campus. And so if you want us to come here, then you need to offer competitive packages, because we're also isolated geographically from other communities of color. And that's just kind of a fact. And so we do feel like we need to be compensated for coming here, because we know we're going to be doing a lion's share of that work already. And a more robust merit review process. I'm not even sure if I would call what we go through a merit review when you look at the compensation and how it's structured right now. It doesn't take into account or recognize the additional labor that many staff of color undertake. And so we think that it should be built into the annual merit review process, so that those of us who are supporting underrepresented students in ways, that these efforts are continually and appropriately compensated on a regular basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauntay. I just want to encourage people to use the Q&A for ideas, so that this isn't an issue of disavowal, but we actually are thinking about solutions with regard to invisible labor. And I wanted to just add on to what Shauntay was saying before passing things over to Jackie Rabouin. And I want to say that, I think it's really instructive for us to know that currently there are zero mechanisms to reward staff right now for doing this kind of invisible labor. And that has a very predictable outcome, which is that your best people are going to leave. And so, right now, on average, there's the possibility of a 3% raise that's based on performance, but we're in the most expensive zip code of all the different UCs. So why not just make the 3% raise for staff a cost of living increase on an annual basis, and then have as a supplement that actually boosts salary, the possibility of a higher percentage raise, right? With an emphasis on DEI, which is buried right now in any kind of staff review process. So, this would be something that could be undertaken. It needs to have our support. So this is something that I would just say that going forward, we're talking about structural situation that impacts students, all workers on this campus, faculty, staff, and other workers on this campus. And we have to think structurally and in solidarity. I'd like to pass things over to Jackie Rabouin.
Thank you, Christine. And also thank you, Shauntay, for making it possible for me to have this job. I really do appreciate it, you and the students. Way to go. To introduce myself again, I am Jackie Rabouin. I am a CAP psychotherapist with the focus on our ABC students, meaning it's my specialty to work with the students who are African, Black, and Caribbean. And we also have others who are also in specialty positions. So that's Erica Lopez, who is working with Latinx students. And then we have Lane Lease, who is working with LGBT. Now, this is significant because what I want to talk to you about is our having to deal with a two-pronged problem at CAPS. Part of that is related to UCOP, so this is system-wide. The other has to do with specifically at UCSC CAPS. So to start with the first one regarding UCOP. So UCOP has arbitrarily divided people who are working at CAPS system-wide between psychologists, meaning people who are licensed PhDs, have licensed PhDs, and psychotherapists, those of us who have licensed master's degrees in counseling or social work, whatever, along with myself, who also has a PhD in East-West psychology, which is specifically a degree about how to conceptualize and come up with solutions that will foster better diversity, equity, and inclusion. This will be significant later on. So what has happened is that we're all part of a contractual agreement, meaning under the union, that received raises and should have been receiving those raises, including 2 over the course of the last year. But because of this arbitrary dividing line done by UCOP. Those of us who were hired, let's say in 2019, have not been allowed to receive the last 2 raises. So that's me and 2 other people who were hired after me. So the result of that is that we're having to go through accretion bargaining to actually try to earn a second time the raises that we were already promised in the original contractual agreements, if you're following me here. All right, so this is extra time, labor, and energy to advocate for something that we should have already received. And this is, again, significant because it can end up being quite a bit of money. So, for example, in my case, because I've been working, not at CAPS, but for 30-year career, and therefore I'm getting a high percentage for master's level people with a PhD. This is adding up to being basically $5,000. And if you include the raise that we're also supposed to get in July coming up this year, that's going to be almost $7,000 that I'm missing out. And it's better for me than it is for my colleagues who are behind me because they're already making less, that their raises would be less. But their expenses, of course, are accruing more and more, just like everybody else's. So for my colleagues, unlike me, they don't own a home. Their transportation needs continue to increase. Gas is astronomical, plus you've got food and all the other things. So for them, in fact, the raises, which will be less, are even more critical for them being able to stay at UC Santa Cruz to have, an affordable lifestyle, which frankly, as everyone knows, is a struggle. All right. So the result of that is that this is additional time and labor to refight a battle. And what that means is this is time and labor that's being taken away from the very students that we were hired to help them with their mental health. This is meaning greater mental health stress on us. And so, we're fighting this battle and we don't want the students to know because this shouldn't be their fight. As what Shauntay was already said they already fought the good fight to have these specialty positions be a part of the CAP system. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing that we're having to fight is CAPS locally just created 2 positions, Associate Director of Outreach and Associate Director of Equity in Mental Health, okay? And this is to address the needs that frankly our students, particularly those who are marginalized groups, have said that they need and are trying to provide it. So these positions have been open, but they are open only to psychologists, meaning the PhD licensed psychologists, not to the licensed psychotherapists, of which group I and others belong to. Even though we who are at the master's level people are the ones who have been providing the foundational outreach and equity in mental health for our students. So the irony is that the very people who've been laying the groundwork on which these higher positions are going to be basing their future work on have been barred from having any, frankly, part of participating in receiving any of the largesse. Because you can see, as being associate directors, they're going to be making more salary, greater benefits, et cetera, et cetera. We're not allowed to participate. Now, I should say that CAPS is going to say that there are reasons for that. And it is legitimate in a sense, because the psychologists provide supervision to our trainees, meaning interns and postdocs who are earning their PhDs to become licensed psychologists. And that's required by the American Psychological Association. So that's valid. But what's missing is that the foundational large percentage of the work that's going to be done is, again, outreach and mental health equity, which I've said that's what we've been doing, because part of the additional labor that we have been providing is going out to meet students where they are. So that's talking to them one-on-one. In addition to providing counseling, it's meeting them after hours to talk about what their concerns are. It's doing presentations after hours about mental health. It's advocating for them when they're trying to get housing or when they have issues with conduct. It's working for them in collaboration with all of the organizations like EOP, AARC, all of these other organizations that are also there to help these students. But they're also not including the additional labor that we do, which is also helping students with mental health issues regarding microaggressions, macroaggressions related to their race, ethnicity, or LGBT status. So for example, students who, one student who has told me about getting micro and macroaggressions on a bus, public transportation, in which the person was called the N-word, as well as phrases that are homophobic. And so I and other staff are having to help this person overcome that. Or another student who was telling me about having joined a swimming group, finding him or themselves in the ocean and looking around, and the other parties who were supposed to be in the group have all disappeared and just left that person out in the ocean by themselves. So we are dealing with constant trauma, okay? And so this is what I mean by it may not be invisible labor, but it's uncompensated labor regarding the intensity of what our students have to do with. Because it's not just about, you know, I failed my math test and now I'm having anxiety about how I'm going to pass, you know, the quarter. It's literally life and death. So UC Santa Cruz has increased suicidal ideations. There have been suicide attempts. There are issues with housing. There are issues with food insecurity. All of these things are part of the intensity that students have to deal with, especially our students who are of marginalized populations. And so what I want to leave you with is this, and I do not say this in the sense of hyperbole or well, I'll put it this way. I'll say it in tongue in cheek, but I say it not only with respect, but with reverence for my ancestors when I make this statement. The last year I have felt like an indentured servant working on the plantation. And this is what I mean by I don't make this statement lightly. It's tongue in cheek, but I say it with respect and reverence for my ancestors who were obviously enslaved. And the reason I say that is because, no, it's not enslavement, but indentured servitude is not being completely free. It's not emancipation. And so what we are asking for, advocating for, is that emancipation. And the reason is, again, because of our students. We are supposed to be the representatives for them on how to deal with these kinds of issues at a predominantly white institution. And we are supposed to be advocating and demonstrating for them how to deal with racism, sexism, all the other isms that we find in an institution that is, yes, demonstrating institutionalized racism. So if we don't manifest this argument and, you know, pursue trying to resolve these issues, then the message that we're not only giving to ourselves, but to our students is that they're not worth it. And I don't think that that's what we want to do. In fact, I thought our task was to demonstrate just the opposite, that they are worth it, and that we are representing and instructing them in ways that will not only help them fight institutionalized forms of isms, whatever they are at UCSC, but for the future of their lives, as well as being able to encourage other people of color to be able to come here at UCSC and make a living wage and continue that fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. You know, we want to open, we have 12 minutes left for conversation. And what we're really hoping was to be able to come away from this conversation with ideas, fortified commitment, the possibility of solidarity moving forward. You know, I'm reminded in terms of what Jackie said that one of the people that wrote in the chat also spoke about having to deal as an Indigenous student with hostility from white professors on this campus. And, you know, students will go to places like CAPS, but it shouldn't be that like what we are training students for is how to deal with like this kind of daily toll of this kind of trauma, and you know, and then like tax you know, people who are already overtaxed like Jackie having to deal with so many students that your schedule is blocked out for like 2-3 weeks, So I want to also begin by saying, like, how can we, there's a lot of questions about faculty and questions of invisible labor, but is there a way that we can come away from this having a commitment with regard to staff? Can we have a commitment to having a base, like arguing for a 3% cost of living increase across the board as something that is just humane? And then from there to think about the incredible additional labor that some of the people on this campus have been doing. When I said that I work intimately with Shauntay, I've seen her do this work. But let's go. There's a really good question. Becca, do you want to take it over from one of our colleagues?
Yeah, I think it's actually related to this point, and maybe we can just hear back if folks have thoughts about this. But Professor Regina Langkow, I think is pushing us to think about how we keep institutions accountable. And while we might have some structures, and she points out the report hate button, for example, is related to the idea of microaggressions on campus. What it ultimately does is that we report people who maybe have done some harm within the community, but there's no way to think about reporting institutions and their accountability. So I wonder if we can take a little bit of space and maybe from folks in their own kind of positions to think about, have people thought about what that looks like? Have you seen something on your own campus where there's any mechanisms for keeping accountable structures, policies, institutional level kinds of practices? I don't know if that includes like contributing to reviews of certain folks. I'm not sure, but I don't know if folks have thought about that. It's a really big question, but I think the other ask there is whether there's interest in developing a community or coalition around thinking through this very thing, because it does, I think, kind of undergird a lot of the things that we're talking about. If there's a way to keep institutions accountable for, something like servingness or the ways that we review. So I don't know if folks have thought about that just now, initial thoughts.
Margaret and Emily, would you mind addressing that? And, for example, one of the issues that came up in our previous event was pointing out a structure that doesn't work, which is the 3-bucket structure. And so like how, we can't report structures when we're talking about structural racism. We have to think about structures. It's not enough to think about, as this very insightful comment reveals, people, right? It's not enough to report hate. How do you report the structure? And, we have reported the structure. The 3-bucket model's not working. We also have the contributions to diversity, which everyone gains. It's a broken category. That's not working. There are things that are not working. But do you have ideas about how the institution can receive structural critique, I guess?
I guess I can jump in. At UCLA, that's exactly sort of what happened with the Moreno report, right? Where Judge Moreno came and just basically did a study and found the policies and the procedures were not fair. They weren't working. And so so the institution had to respond. It wasn't just the people who were behaving discriminatorily, but the institution had to do it. It was done systematically. I know a lot of the work that has in sort of the OB work finds that, for example, when you make the department or the organization take ownership of the problems and putting together task forces to do systematic studies to find out how you fix it. So the accountability through transparency is one way to motivate leaders to really take ownership. Having sort of forums like this where people can actually identify and talk about the issues that are at stake. Again, that's where it makes things transparent, puts pressure on leaders to have to do something to address it, not just through the complaint grievance systems where it's just focused on individuals, but they can see there's more systemic issues involved, and that makes them have to like think about, okay, well, how do we solve this? How do we create processes that will examine systems and policies and procedures and look at where those problems are so that we can change them. So I think those are a few things that you can start thinking about. And I think we've been thinking a lot about that at UCLA. We don't have all the answers, but it's something that we've been thinking about.
And how was that report initiated? You know, like in other words, like how did that come about?
It preceded my time, but there were a couple of very egregious cases that came to light. And I think then the report came out and it got a lot of attention. I mean, what happened was then our Attorney General at that time, who's now our VP, Kamala Harris, basically said, you got to fix this. You got to address this. And so that sort of motivated.
I see. Thank you. Emily.
Thanks. Well, I'm sure there are others on my campus who could speak about the broader issues that you're raising. I think as it relates to this faculty evaluation domain and the inequities inherent in that, I think that the reason in the original form that our CAP chair wrote that evaluation, she noted that units did an uneven job of advocating or sort of framing the cases coming up from departments. And I think that, and I know you also had some salary equity surveys going on in your campus that I found, et cetera, that you shared. I think that this issue, when you see inequities across disciplines and you realize that those disciplines, you know, they're not random in terms of how faculty of color and women are distributed, you can't just sort of control for discipline or unit, or, you know, there are issues in there. And so I think that this policy, these guidelines were an example of saying like this playing field needs to be more even. And then they similarly, I think what a lot of faculty do is if you're in a field where there's a lot more grant money, then you hire up and kind of create a buffer around you to deal with the systems that are so frustrating for partnered scholarship, for example. And not everyone has access to the same kind of grant money, external extramural funds. And so there are inequities there in terms of, you know, so all that to us speaks to the need that we can't just create these sort of city states where certain people get funded to not deal with the system. We really want to change the systems as best we can, or have pilots that then can be adopted. And we're really gratified that there seems to be some movement around some of this, or some openness to considering this on our campus. And I think a lot of it relates to, you know, if there's funding to do it, great, do it. So anyway, I don't know if that speaks to it, but I think these are structural issues that are not randomly distributed in how they're born by different faculty members, and also by the students who are training into those more public impact, public focused careers.
Yeah, you know, right, I had mentioned before the IRAPS survey, which I think is unfortunately potentially getting propagated as, you know, indicating that, oh, there are some differences in salary and promotion when it comes to faculty of color and women faculty. That it's not an intersectional analysis at all, but all of that goes away if you account for departments. And so there's something that about the kinds of quantitative data that's getting the context is not getting considered, that are getting interpreted in very skewed, overly optimistic ways that do not correspond with the demoralization that we have all expressed here. You know, all of us have expressed demoralization, you know, or we've described it or we have expressed it. And yeah, you know, I wonder, actually, Margaret, you had made a really interesting point in a conversation I had with you before about trying to recognize the problem, materially address for it, doesn't actually create equity. Because could you speak about that just a bit? Because I think that's
Sure.
Useful.
Yeah, it's an important point, which is that getting rid of all the disadvantages, like we talk a lot about disadvantages that minorities have in an organization, but getting rid of those, addressing only the disadvantages does not create equity. You also need to address advantages. You know, there's advantages that I guess people will have that minorities don't have, and you get rid of the disadvantages. It only brings them up to this point. There's still going to be a gap because people don't have the advantages that others have, and so you also need to look at how to create advantages as well, and privileges, I guess, is the word that is used commonly now, and that also. So I think you sort of have to look at it from both angles.
I think that that's such an insightful and interesting point. You know, unfortunately, we are at time, and this is the kind of discussion that merits multiple conversations. And I want to say that, you know, thank you so much to everyone who put such thoughtful comments in the Q&A. And I really want to thank everyone here today who participated in this conversation for the quality of your ideas, for the courage of being willing to share your experiences, and for also your flexibility and being willing to engage with this. I think that what we have right now is, you know, like change is so slow in coming. It takes forever to fight for it. And oftentimes it's a communicative disconnect between the 70% up here and then the people who are doing the lion's share of work down here. And the who's are trying to have a say here. And I'm saying also here that doing a slightly modified business as usual, it's not going to cut it. It's really not going to cut it. Serious structural change requires courage. It really requires courage. And, you know, also, you know, one of the points that's been made too is this campus can't sit on its laurels with data that's not sufficiently disaggregated, right? There's all sorts of things that we have to discuss, but you know, I really want to thank everyone again for both attending, for taking part in this 3-part series. And I just have to say too, you know, like to have a deeper sense of what's happening internally and to have had this incredible opportunity to engage with Margaret and Emily, and some of the resources and some of the things that you've pointed to, we will for sure place on the CRJ website. And what typically happens after this is the central administration asks for a link to these events. We will make sure to share those as well. And Stefano, if you don't mind, we will share those with you so you could share it with the other 10 members of CAP. Okay. Well, thank you all so very much. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and I hope a very relaxing weekend.